The goal for this training is to go over SEQRA and ins and outs, the what we shoulds, the what we shouldn'ts.
Right.
And if you could provide us a little guidance as to whether we've been doing it wrong, right, indifferent, or maybe how you would like us to do it going forward to make sure that we are covered for our.
Perfect.
So Dave, it's 7:20. I have an hour and a half slated, but if you probably want to go an hour, I think everybody would be great.
We're going to move as quickly as possible. I was shocked
Shocked.
to see that the printout of this is 20 pages.
Yes.
I guarantee you we will not go through every line of
That's
20 pages.
okay. All
Here's
right.
what we're going to do. We are going to, I want to take a few minutes and sort of discuss some broad overall ideas and themes and reasons and stuff like that. And then what you have here is portions of 4 of the SEQRA section. There are the SEQRA regulations are in part 617 of the DEC's regulations. That's divided into a number of sections. I think there's about 15, 16, 17 of them. We're going to do the core 4. You guys don't know what that is. We're going to do the core 4 of for what this board typically deals with on all the time. There may be a situation where you get to one of the other ones, but these are the 4 that we deal with, and really only the headliners on those. There's a lot of other nits and pieces, and we're not going to do that because.
Should I go outside and tell them they're exceeding ambient noise?
Yeah. Like, are they yelling out there? Like, outside?
Just kidding.
All right,
Sorry.
so first, let's talk about what we're doing and why. So, why are we doing SEQRA? Why do we bother?
This isn't going to be Q&A, is it?
Well, what do you guys want?
I'm gonna kind of stupid.
Some
This kind of stupid.
people don't like lectures.
Teacher.
All right, I'll lecture them. Well, Marie, why are we doing SEQRA?
Because we have to.
Okay, that's not as bad of an answer as it sounds.
It's the law.
It's
It's
the
the
right?
law, but it's.
Why do we have to?
Identification of environmental impacts.
Exactly.
Exactly. It's the
Say that again.
identification of environmental impacts.
What?
Because that's the law.
Because that's the law.
So we're in compliance with the State Environmental Quality Review Act.
Number one,
as
it's a
a
law.
municipal board.
And what we do is we identify environmental impacts for a couple of reasons. Other than that, it's the law. The most important reason is that you guys on this board, you don't want to, and this is true of every agency under the law, and you do not want to do something that is going to cause significant adverse environmental impact. And therefore, what the government has said is you need to study this. And just to give you a little bit of historical background, does anybody know where SEQRA came from and why it's here? How it happened?
Somebody did something.
New York State. Well, I'll give you a hint. It did not originate in New York State. It actually, the issue originated in New York State, but the law didn't. This is derived from a federal law called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which is the acronym. And NEPA was actually, SEQRA was passed in 1975. Are you being a problem?
How's with water quality?
I'm trying to hydrate.
Okay.
It was started with Nixon, actually.
Nixon signed NEPA in March 1969. And the reason why NEPA, the particular issue that NEPA came from, the fact situation, does anybody know what caused the NEPA? What caused the requirement for the government to study the environmental impacts of what they do?
I really don't.
Something in California.
No,
Ohio?
no.
Rivers?
Well, it was a river, but it was not in Ohio, or it was east of those 2 states.
There was a river that
How about the
actually
Hudson?
went on.
It was the Hudson.
The Hudson, sorry, and you got it first. The Hudson River. There's a mountain, Thousand Foot High Mountain, that's what we call mountains, on the Hudson River called Storm King Mountain. It's actually.
That's right.
Thank
Right.
you.
Okay, Marty, you tell us.
Well, no, you told us to, but I'm remembering
I'll tell
now.
you.
And no, the whole Pacific
Pardon?
not the Palisades. They were going to be taking down the Palisades. Wasn't there some kind of, the Palisades are from the George Washington Bridge to the north, right?
Right.
And that's
Not
on the
far,
river?
not far, oh,
Storm King Mountain.
Okay, Storm King is.
Storm King Mountain, they
Storm
wanted
King.
to create a hydroelectric plant.
That was it.
Very, very close. First of
No.
all, let's talk about Storm King Mountain.
Never mind,
That's
wait,
West
not
Point.
finished. They wanted to pump the water up to the top of the mountain,
Pump
and
storage.
drill through the mountain and have a
All right.
sluice that
Here we
would go
go.
down to the,
Early 60s.
and everybody said it's gonna affect the shad that were in place.
That's one of the issues, that, stripers. Okay,
Yeah.
we're in the early 60s, right? And what's the invention that changed the world in the 60s?
Nuclear power.
What?
Duct tape.
Yeah, aside from that. Air conditioning,
Oh, yeah.
right? So what happens when people in the city and other places want to use air conditioning?
Electricity.
Electricity what?
Consumption.
Spikes.
Yeah.
Right? So we get times when we need a lot more electricity, but we don't want to build a power plant for all those peak times, right? So what are we gonna do? We're gonna have regular power plants and we're gonna have peaker facilities when people turn their air conditioners on July afternoons in the city, right?
Okay.
So what we're gonna have is a peak, and have this particular peaker facility, what they were gonna do was, again, no more power plants, but when there's low consumption, like in the evening, in the summer, we're gonna take the Hudson River and we're gonna pump the water up to the top of the mountain. And we're gonna blow off the top of the mountain in order to do this. And then when people turn their air conditioners on, we're gonna let the water out of the top of the mountain, go through a turbine, which is actually, I think it's gonna be inside the mountain, and then down and let it out at the end. And the Federal Power Commission in 1963 permitted it without knowing what the hell they were doing. And this singular event created Scenic Hudson. It's actually, in some ways, it started the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, which became Riverkeeper, and led to a massive lawsuit. And that massive lawsuit actually led to two of the critical environmental principles that we still live under 60 years later. The 1965 case, Second Circuit, which is the federal appeals court, one step below the Supreme Court, sitting in New York City. And what they found two environmental principles. One is that citizens had a right to sue to protect the environment. You didn't have to have like some sort of monetary, somebody broke a contract and you were out $1 million. You could sue because it was an environmental problem. And secondly, the government had to study the impact of what they were doing before they did it. So if they didn't do something stupid like blow the top of Storm King Mountain. For those of you who don't know what Storm King is, if you're ever on the Hudson heading south, let's say from Newburgh, toward West Point actually, you will see, let's say you're in New Windsor, at Coalition State Park. You will see the river narrow and you'll see these mountains ahead of you. And that's actually where the Hudson Highlands cross the Hudson River. The Hudson Highlands are about 15 miles wide. It's actually the prime of the Appalachians that connects New Jersey and Pennsylvania up to the Appalachians in New England. It's where the Appalachian Trail goes right through at Bear Mountain. But north of that, there's two sort of mountains on either side of the river that are part of the Hudson Highlands. And on the west side is Storm King, and on the east side is Breakneck Ridge. Right? Storm King is the one on the west.
Everybody to go on 218. So
that's right. 218. Well, 218 goes right across Storm King Mountain. That's when they were going to blow up. Anyway, the point is, the federal appeals court decided that the government had to study this impact before they did it. And 4 years later, the federal government passed the National Environmental Policy Act. And the reason why I'm telling you all this is because it gets to the fundamental issue for SEQRA, which is that every agency, federal agency under NEPA, SEQRA, state agencies, local agencies, like everybody here, has to know the impact of what they're doing before they do it, no matter what they do. That's whenever they take an action, okay? What are the actions we're talking about? What actions do local agencies take? There are three types of actions. You can do a project yourself, like if the town board decides to, let's say, build a new town hall, they're gonna just go ahead, or build a fence around town hall, they're gonna get out a bulldozer and do it. That you can fund an action, which means you're letting somebody else do it with your money, or you can permit, and issue a permit, which is what we do, right? We issue permits. Therefore, we need to study the impact of what we're doing before we issue the permits. The impact is on the environment. What's the environment? Anybody know? You have to study the environmental impact. What's the environment that we're impacting?
impacts to air, water, land.
Air, water, land, but that's all that's true.
The 10 items in the EIS, in the EAF.
Well, we'll get to the answer in a second. You're onto something. I want to make just one point here. The impact of the environment that's being impacted is everything that Helena mentioned on the natural environment, habitat, trees, air, water, everything, and garbage and all those physical impacts. But it's also human impacts, noise, visuals, scenery.
Sightlines.
What?
Sightlines.
Well, historical impacts. You can't, if the site plan you're approving is gonna build a Walmart next to where George Washington slept, you've got a problem, because we just screwed up through 250 years of scenery, and that's one of the impacts that we need to know about before we do it. So we got the natural impacts, which hurt the birds and the bees and all the natural things, because they could be screwed up somehow, but also people impacts as well. All those are impacts. All right, let's see what else we need to cover here. Okay, now a little bit more sort of boiling it down. The other thing that SEQRA does for us is that what we just did before, what you guys were discussing, first of all, there were no natural impacts involved. We weren't talking about killing species or anything like that, but you were focusing on human impacts, but you weren't doing it as part of SEQRA.
Correct.
We had actually set SEQRA to the side, and we'll come back and discuss whether that was a good idea, but you were looking at the specifics for site plan approval, right? For this, unlike the Federal Power Commission in 1963, many of the agencies that grant permits now, or even that do actions, have environmental regulations written right into what they've got to do before they allow it, including this one. Your site plan approval regulations have all sorts of environmental stuff, either natural environment or people environment, right? And that's exactly what we were doing before. SEQRA essentially requires you to do the same thing. Look at the environmental, it may not have all the specific standards, because SEQRA covers every environmental impact, like we said, all the birds and the bees and also the human ones. And the point is, one of the reasons why we do SEQRA, in addition to all the other ones that we mentioned, is that it provides a unified, structured way to deal with everything that's before you. Like you've got, in this case, you've got noise impact, which is right front and center. You may have other ones as well. Traffic is a SEQRA impact, because that's again, that's not the critters, that's people. So you may have to look at traffic as part of your site plan approval. What we find is that no matter what the agency is, whether it's you or DEC or the Department of State or the town board or whatever it is, if you follow SEQRA, you're essentially going to be covering all of the things you've got to do under the statute, especially if when you do the SEQRA review, you make sure you're looking at the statute to know the things you've got to do. And that's one of the reasons why we do SEQRA. It's also one of the reasons why everybody that comes in here for a site plan approval or subdivision approval, most people talk about that as a SEQRA process. You may have heard that before. That's why, now, what you did a few minutes ago was not SEQRA, we just acknowledged that, but they would consider it part of the SEQRA process, because SEQRA is a nice little handy all-in-one tool for doing all this. And that's why following the SEQRA rules and keeping your eye also on your actual site plan requirements is the way most boards would do it. So your SEQRA process and following SEQRA actually becomes sort of the governing structure of your approval.
So can I ask at that level, when do you feel this board should conduct a SEQRA review?
That's a great question, because that actually gets to what I just said. And the answer is your SEQRA review starts almost at the very, very beginning when people walk in here, and typically it ends very, very close to site plan. The whole thing, we may not want to do this.
So would Dave Church put in his review, because he reviews it, he'll go, this application is complete or not complete, or would there be a trigger that Dave would put in his review that said, we are ready, based on the information provided, we are ready for a SEQRA?
Well, when you say SEQRA, when you say SEQRA review, I think you're using a shorthand for finalizing the SEQRA review with a declaration of significance.
That's correct.
Presumably in neg deck.
Correct.
That's just the final step of the SEQRA review. The critical thing about the SEQRA review is that you're learning all this stuff
As
the
you're
whole
going.
time.
Okay.
And that's why I'm saying the SEQRA review, once you get done with the SEQRA review, if it's done well, you should be able to then turn you're doing neg deck or whatever it is. Then if it's a POS deck, you got to do an environmental impact statement. But if it's a neg deck, you're done with the SEQRA.
Yep.
And then you should be able to do almost all of your actual site plan review under those criteria very, very quickly, because all those criteria
Have been
are loaded back in to your scope of what you're doing.
So so on that topic where there's human impacts, garbage, noise, traffic, site distances, is there a checklist or something that we should be?
all the different types of issues?
Well, yes, but like Rick and I will go
That's
through,
what the,
That's what, yeah.
right, so, but the applicant is completing the long form, the applicant's completing that on the front end. And they're providing that with their application, Jasmine provides that. And then we would do the short form once we feel, the part two, we would do the 10 questions, once we feel that we have all the answers.
well, they had the option to do either the short form or the long.
This, yeah.
We
Do you-
generally ask them, many of the we want you to do the long.
Correct.
Right.
So do you feel like, and I guess the question's back to you, do you feel like there is, I'm gonna throw a number, 25 items that we should be checking off as we're looking through applications? For instance, just because on this application, we're looking about noise, okay, and we're talking about Akron Speedway, there's a large focus about noise. We might be missing that there's a flora or a fauna problem.
Yeah, you are missing it because you.
Does that make sense? So is there something that we can utilize as a,
So what we've done, and maybe we're jumping way ahead
Okay.
of the script that Dave.
Yep.
But real quick, that long form gives you the opportunity, first of all, our consultant should be looking at that and saying, hey, wait a minute, guys, you got a real. Or we're looking at it ourselves and say, hey, wait a minute, we got a real problem. Here.
sure,
Either they've misstated what is the case, or they've indicated, yeah, there's gonna be impacts. We then take that and determine whether it's significant enough to have to go to a pause deck.
I'm just
Or
thinking,
it's not significant enough, and it's an egg deck. It being an egg deck, and I'm really jumping around, it being an egg deck doesn't mean you don't have them do certain studies.
of course, I'm just thinking
Well,
on,
I think
You
I'm
have
way
to-
ahead of this.
Yeah, it's.
and I'm just thinking about it as an applicant standpoint.
Study.
No, I know.
You can't do any of this until you figure out what's going on.
Well, I'm
So-
just trying to think about it as an applicant standpoint. If I'm walking and going, hey, I'd like to do a 2-lot subdivision, I've never done this before. Okay, here's the EAF, fill it out, and they go, I don't know what flora or fauna is, no. Does
Okay.
Dave check,
Whether or not this is true, and it may not be true, everybody on the board is an amateur. You are not expected to know anything,
of course,
so don't even worry about it.
Okay.
And in fact, when you think you know stuff, that's when lots of errors get made.
you really don't.
The short answer to what both of you are saying is, you may be amateurs, but you actually are in luck, because you have people to help you. And I'm not talking about, and you have professionals, and I'm not talking about me, because I'm also an amateur when it comes to anything. So lawyers know nothing other than whatever's in the book. So I know nothing about the Ackwood Speedway. I know nothing about any of the projects you've got before you.
Sure.
The two professionals that you have to help you, one is sitting over here.
Yep.
And he has an incredible amount of experience, and the other is an engineer who has both experience and also other folks to help him. So the best thing you can do when somebody walks in the door, sits down here and says, this is what I want to do, I want to do this, I want to do this one, if I were you, I would turn to David and I would turn to Greg, if he's here, and I'd say, what are the expected secret, and what Rick said is correct, the applicant may say, we know there's gonna be noise here, we know there's gonna be
Sure,
traffic.
sure. They're outlining it.
We know there's wetlands, we're gonna stay away from, he may tell you all these things, you write them all down.
Yeah.
Then you say to Dave, then you say to Greg, what are we in the applicant missing here? And they will tell you all these things, and then at that point, you now know, and by the way, you also have lived in the town for however many years or decades, so
So
you may know.
yeah.
Just because you may be an amateur, but you may know that this is gonna cause this problem, I can see it from here, so
And that's a good example right there, because Rick and I had a conversation about the Vly. Like on the dignified ones, we know that the Vly could be a potential, environmental area of concern, environmental critical area. So was it? So that's something that we checked off of those.
So the first thing you
we have
do
that.
is, you come up with all these possible secret issues, again, the natural ones and also the ones on people. And then you ask Dave and Greg, how do we get to the bottom of this? What do you need to do? What do we study? What does the applicant need to do? And then what's gonna end up happening is that the progress of the review gets generated by the science, by the studies, by the things. And you don't need to worry about the regulatory stuff. You don't need to worry about the part two, although you can.
Yeah.
We don't need to really deal with it. I take a somewhat skeptical view of the EAF, because that's a sort of a device the DEC invented to drag you along by the nose if you didn't otherwise have a good sense for where you're going. But the good thing is you do have a good sense for where you're going, because we're here to tell you.
Sure.
And also you know yourself. And so after Dave and Greg come in and say, these are the issues you to do, then you figure out, all right, how are we gonna do this? And Greg will say something like, well, I'll talk to the engineer, and I'll talk to Nadine, we're gonna force her to do the studies, the traffic counts, the visual, you can do a visual impact assessment. DEC's got regulations for that, because guess what, we're building a 10-story tower that's going next to the ridge, so we need to know about the visuals, and we need to know about the we're going to do the traffic, and we're going to do the traffic counts. Your consultants will do all of this.
So, okay, so
And
we'll
then
stop on that
when they
topic.
get done with that, then we'll have a big argument with the public and each other about what this means and whether they got to do more. And then at the end of all that, you will have a body of knowledge, which then lets you go through a part two, and then lets you go through a declaration of significance. And then at that point, then you can actually permit the project or not, and put in the conditions that you need, because now you know the things that SEQRA wants you to know.
So historically in this board.
One quick thing, Dave, have I said anything that's incorrect?
So
You tell me if I do.
Historically,
Stay away. Stay away. We really like it.
historically, this board would get an application. We would go around the room. Rick would say, I'm worried about parking. Zori would say, I'm worried about, sight lines. Zach would say, I think we're cutting too many trees. We have too many areas of disturbance. Do you think that we should, rather than starting with, because we all create a sort of a checklist of items that we think are concerns. Do you think we should start with our consultants and say, what have you found?
You should, but you should add to it. I mean, if someone says, I'm worried about, first one that you mentioned two different.
Sight lines.
Sightlines, that's something, Greg, how do we check on the sightlines and how do we check on the visuals? Is there, and we'll say, well, DEC has this, protocol and they get into that. The other one you mentioned cutting trees, which I think is really important.
Areas of
because
disturbance.
that question is operational. He's cutting trees. Think in terms of impacts. Why are you concerned about him cutting trees? Is it because he's tearing down habitat for something important? Is it a visual? Is
Bats, who knows?
Okay, so
Sure.
So it's a habitat thing. So the secret question is, are we damaging important habitat? And then specifically in terms of the cutting of the trees or the hours of operation or whatever this is, and you leave that and say, Greg, who can we ask to find out if the habitats? Start thinking in terms of impacts, because when you have a conversation with these folks about the things that they're doing, they turn around. You run into two problems that I see over and over again, including tonight. One is that he says something like, oh, I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to do anything. All we want to do is clear up a little bit of this. And you're not talking about impacts. You just you're talking about something
I don't
else.
really care, right?
And, or you may say something like, don't worry, we're never gonna clear more than this. I swear to God, you don't have it, say, all right, well, then can I put that in your conditions?
Exactly.
That's not where the conversation is. You need to stop having conversations that are informal with the applicants who say anything to get past the question and then do it all the time. I hear, and I'm giving you the deference to not jump in and say, you can't do that, but I'll give you some examples if you want. Think in terms of impacts and every time somebody says, my neighbors like me, or,
Yeah.
he said
Subjective.
he said that tonight.
Yes, he did.
I want to question my children.
Yeah,
Well, he said that too.
actually, but that was, I want to make money. I want to make money, so we know you want to make money, that's why you're here.
Right.
We're gonna let you do that, we're gonna regulate. So think in terms of impacts. Do you have enough information on the impacts? Do we have the guarantee, either because of the study that shows there's no possibility of a problem, or we're going to put in constraints that we need that the impact
mitigate.
is mitigated so that it's not going to be a significant impact. Not you want to leave it to your kids, not I swear I would never do that, not sometimes it's going to be 500 cars, sometimes it's going to be 1,000 cars. By the way, I did a quick look. More than 500 cars is a type 1 action. We'll talk about what that means, but
That that opens up seeker.
no,
No.
SEQRA is open anyway.
No, right.
That puts it in a little bit, that means.
Type 1
games we're doing, we don't do it. I'll talk about type 1 later, but that's a big deal. This thing can be a big deal, and you've got a lot of people looking at it. So again, I didn't want to jump in and say, but I'm telling you, all right, we now know what we're doing. We're trying to get information. It's the law. It's going to help us make our decisions, and we want to protect the town, right? And in this case, we don't want to run crosswise with a bunch of people that are staring down at us. All right. One quick thing I also have on the bottom of page 1 of this thing here. Let's sort of limitations. SEQRA covers everything. Are there any limitations on what it covers? Specifically, what if we don't have regulatory jurisdiction? Can we then say, we're not going to deal with it. We don't have regulatory jurisdiction or something.
Okay. We address it to somebody who does it.
So we should defer to the people that do, right? No, that's wrong. When SEQRA is being done correctly, there's a lead agency.
Oh,
We'll talk about that too. Right. Lead agency. What a lead agency means is that there's a bunch of other agencies that are involved, and instead of every agency doing their own SEQRA review, because SEQRA, remember, a SEQRA review covers everything. It's not limited. So one agency gets chosen as the lead. We'll talk. You guys already know that. We can talk about the rules more. But when that agency gets chosen as the lead, they do the SEQRA review for everybody. They're essentially the agent, the agency, the agent for everybody else, which means we've got to do two things in terms of generating, and that gets to the second question, what if somebody else has regulatory jurisdiction? Some things that nobody's got jurisdiction over, sometimes somebody else has jurisdiction over it. Like if somebody wants to come in and fill a wetland or a portion of a wetland, DEC is going to regulate that, right? So should we even bother? Answer, yes. because we need to know if this is gonna have a significant adverse environmental impact. We have to study that, and then the information we generate is gonna be helpful to us when we do our site plan approval, but it's also gonna be helpful to that other agency because they're not doing a secret. So we generate those impacts. In fact, we generate those issues. There is even numerous court cases that say we have no authority to delegate the secret review to that other agency. They will keep their jurisdiction. They will still get their permits. There's a rule that says secret doesn't change the jurisdiction of agencies. For years, Helena was involved with DEC doing permitting for mines, right? Let's suppose somebody comes in here, wants to do a mine, it's gonna generate traffic, it's gonna generate noise, it's gonna generate dust. DEC is gonna regulate a lot of that, not all of it. They may not look at the
We're
traffic.
typically our lead agency.
Because
of the mine land reclamation law.
Okay.
DEC is lead agency on 90% of.
Wrong issue then. If she was, now she's a wetlands person, she's doing the wetlands review. DEC wetlands people do not care about the secret review that we're doing. They will not even look at it. They figure we're just gonna do our wetlands permitting, but that doesn't mean we don't look at that very carefully. And the truth is that we do. So SEQRA does not limit our review, no matter if we don't have jurisdiction. And that goes right back to the very beginning. Federal Power Agency had no authority to look at fish when they were looking at Storm King. That was the problem. The real question is, that's an obvious problem. They didn't have the jurisdiction. So NEPA and now SEQRA require that, SEQRA for state agencies. What if though you do have that jurisdiction right in your law? Like what if DEC has all these wetlands rules? We have all these site plan rules. So can we just rely on the site plan rules and not do SEQRA? No. We've got to do SEQRA because we don't know what SEQRA is going to turn up. It could be traffic, it could be everything. Like I said, if you do SEQRA, almost everything else you need to do is going to be covered because you're also looking at those requirements too. And therefore the SEQRA review becomes the driving factor. I would recommend strongly that we not think in terms of pushing it to the side or just what are my milestones in SEQRA. When do I do my part 2? Step back, pull your experts in, let experts with you generate all of the information that you need. When you get done with that, you're now ready to do all of your regulatory issues and you can send it on to all the other involved agencies.
So you would say that Greg and Dave would say, okay, based on the information we have, I feel comfortable that we have enough information to make a secret review.
Yeah, they'll say, well, that they are doing the secret review. They may say, we feel comfortable, we have enough information to finalize the secret review
Right.
and to recommend a declaration of significance and then to move forward with the regulatory, with your permit. One other quick secret rule, so everybody knows this, I think you already do. The secret review, because your job is to make sure you know stuff before you take your action, the secret review must be completed before any agency can take their action. We need to know what the adverse environmental impacts are before we take an action. A secret review is completed in either of 2 circumstances. Well, if it's a type 2 action, then you don't even do a secret review. We will get to that. But if it goes through secret review, you either end up with a negative declaration or you end up with an environmental impact statement in a document at the end of that called a finding statement, where you take the whole environmental impact statement process, which is huge, and you boil it down to a series of findings. That finalized those 2 things, either of those things finalizes the secret process, at which point you can go ahead and start thinking about it.
So hang on a second. It would be a negative determination or a positive determination, and the positive determination would generate an EIS.
That's right. It's a little bit backwards if you're thinking about how bad something is, but negative just means there's no
impact. But
So-
positive means there is, and we need an EIS, and that needs to be drilled out to a finding.
Except for one thing. Positive means there might be. There are 2 decision points for a declaration of significance. We're confident there's no significant adverse impact, and that means any of the possible impacts. Like if Greg and Dave identified 7 impacts on wetlands, on air quality, on traffic, on visuals, etc. When you do a neg deck, you are saying of those things that have been identified and anything else that we are aware of, reasonable. It can't be everything. You're not going to look at, if you're not going to look at visuals if somebody's doing a 2-lot subdivision, for example, probably not. But it depends on the project. But a neg deck says of all the impacts that have been identified, we have determined that none of them are going to have a significant adverse environmental impact. If you're not sure, if you think that you might, do a pause deck. And I want to say one more thing here, which is going to make it go a little bit better. The way
Hang on that topic. In the long form review, okay, there's 20 items, whatever the number is. If 19 of them are negative, no adverse impact, Dave and Greg and everybody on the board agrees, but one item is of concern, does that automatically generate a positive?
Well, you just a much more complicated question than you meant to. If
Well, I'm just, like, for instance, we went through, I'm using this example, and here's a long form here. We went through this when we did DeJager. We went through each individual line item, and then we went back to the category. Number 11, no. Number 12, yes. Number 13, no. If one of these,
I understand the question, let me go on.
go ahead.
What, it depends, the answer to your question is it depends why you're going through the part two.
Okay.
There are two reasons to go through a part two. One is the actual legitimate one, and one is the one that you're referring to.
Yeah.
The legitimate one is, again, DEC has set up the EAF to be sort of a kind of a flow chart for people that need that, almost as a crutch, and I don't mean to be, pejorative.
Let's
but
make
it's kind
sense
of a-
covering it all.
And so, when it's used properly, that part two is a crutch that lets us go through those questions, and if something is what you're calling moderate to large, whether it's one or a bunch, what it means is, then we've got to do a part three that explains how we come down. It doesn't mean that that's a pause deck. What it means is, it's a part three, it goes into a part three,
Right.
which is again the sort of the third level of what DEC is doing, where we actually explain whether that possible moderate to large, why, if it's going to get a neg deck or a pause deck, and why. Now, you are doing something else. With your question implied something else, and I didn't say it's illegitimate, but it's really kind of a shorthand. You are using, what your question implied is that you are using the part two with all those questions in it, essentially as your checklist for determining all the issues for a neg deck or pause deck. And part of what's good, and that is semi-okay. But what I have in this packet for you guys is actually the printout of 61787, which is the actual regulatory checklist. And it starts on, I actually put it pretty close up front, even though it's the latest section.
Page 3?
Page 3. From page 3 to probably page 6 gives you that checklist of things to look at. That's the real checklist, okay? You're using a part two as sort of a pocket checklist. So assuming for the moment that's legitimate, and we could get to that or not, it's not terrible, but it's not great. Let's put it that way. This is the real checklist. But if that becomes what we're doing as our checklist, because it's sort of like this, and you can look at the language and you can see that it's sort of like it, then the answer to the question is yes. If you were to look at one of those things and say, rather than moderate to large impact, what you really mean is this might have a significant adverse environmental impact, which is the question for a declaration of significance. Yes, that's a pause deck. Any single finding of any of the 10 impacts that Dave and Greg identified, if 9 of them we're cool with it, but one of them is like, Jesus, we're not really sure. This thing might be an endangered species, or we don't know how the traffic's going to turn out because the study was lousy. Or, yeah, you're doing an EIS, and
Wow.
that's the way the law reads. That's the way the regs read. And what I was going to say was that.
So it almost sounds like, well, I can't remember ever doing a pause deck here.
Sounds like we should.
Many of the projects that we've done should have had a pause deck.
That's you anticipated where I'm going on this. When the regs and the process were first written, and again, this law goes back to 75, the presumption was very different than what we're doing now. The presumption was that most projects were going to require an EIS. The EIS was going to be kind of a short, punchy thing that we're going to get done within a couple of months. And the only thing that gets neg deck, it's pretty obvious. We don't need to hold a hearing on a neg deck. There's no in the regs. There's no hearing on a neg deck that's required. You can do it, and it's actually not a bad idea for
Hearing meaning a public hearing?
Yeah.
So in the event that we declare the SEQRA determination a negative declaration, it does not need to be a public hearing?
Yes, but that's not what even you don't have to hold a public hearing before you do a declaration of either declaration.
That's what I was asking.
And that's a problem. I would argue that that's a problem for reasons I can get to. But the way it was originally contemplated was neg deck would be something you figure out very quickly on the smallest things. If the town wants to paint the town hall red, that's going to get a neg deck. It's easy. Everything else is probably going to get. There's a presumption of a pause deck, especially for type 1 action, and we'll just get that done real quickly. But what happened was EIS has got to be really, really big, really quickly, and so what happens is there are towns like this, you never do an EIS, and what that means is the process of leading up to a neg deck is actually where your environmental review and your mitigation gets done. So that becomes a very big deal. So if things have worked out differently, but the answer to your question is yes. Again, assuming that we're using the part two in that kind of not really good way to be the criteria for declaration of significance. If you find that there is one potentially significant adverse environmental impact, you do a pos dec, which is why we try not to, so that we don't have to do that. But trying not to is actually a good thing, because it doesn't mean we're going to ignore it. What
Sure.
it means is we're going to make Greg and Dave, and especially the applicant and his engineer, fix it.
Or
Do
provide mitigation or.
Well, dude, we've got a
Delineate,
problem.
mitigate.
You don't really want us to take a vote on declaration of significance now, so maybe we can talk about whether we're going to fix this thing.
Exactly. That makes sense.
And that's the process that is not in the regulations, but it's the most important thing we do. So we're a little bit off the grid, and that's why a lot of the processes we're going to talk about are things that are just a good idea, but you're not going to find it in regs. And so, but that's the way SEQRA really
Because
works.
that's what we'll do. We'll say, Rick is good to say, well, this is what you have to do if you want to get this
And
approved.
that's why you can't have a conversation with them where you invite them to say something like, I'd never do that. Or,
Right.
Yeah, no.
My wife would kill me if I did something like that. I grew up on this land, and my kids are going to get.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Doesn't
that's
matter.
why you don't have this conversation, because this is super serious. We need to have a serious conversation how we're gonna mitigate this. Otherwise, we're gonna get to that, what you would do on a part two, and I would say is let's look at 617, go through that checklist, and oops,
There it
this
is.
one's a problem. Come back when you do your DEIS.
And you can also, sorry.
Don't we sometimes, do ourselves a disservice when we do a neg deck? Because if you do a neg deck, there are certain things you can't ask the applicant to do.
I'm not sure where you're going with that, but
Well,
I'll
we're
tell you
going
this.
with it.
When you do a premature neg deck, that's when you do yourself a disservice. And when when you're jumping to conclusions, when you're jumping, whether it's SEQRA or otherwise, in the case where you decided not to do a noise study, where everybody kind of came in and started screaming about the noise. I'll give you one example. On the Jaeger, right? On the Jaeger, we heard a lot, we talked to the applicant a lot, we did a neg deck, and then we held a public hearing. And that's actually was okay, because the public hearing is going to be on the subdivision approval. You don't have to have a public hearing on the declaration of significance. What we heard in the public hearing was a lot of comment, and one in particular I remember from a fellow named Ira Stern, who I actually knew from 30 years ago, because he was working with New York City DEP when I was at Riverkeeper. We were both working on the watershed. I haven't seen him in decades. But when he stood up and he said was, remember what he said? Everybody remember?
We talked about flyover of birds
On the Rondout Creek,
around our.
as a flyway.
Yep.
When we did our neg deck, how many people looked at that potential impact and knew about it? Nobody. So we neg decked it, and then here's Ira talking about, we've now got a flyway for migratory birds. And it's like, oh, guess what? And the other thing I'll point out, just because I remember it in some way what we said before, when we pointed this out to Nadine, remember what Nadine said? And he was right, there was one lot that was actually kind of sticking out of the road, kind of into what the buffer area. What Nadine said
Lot
was,
three.
what?
Lot three. I
Lot
think.
3. What Nadine said was, first of all, the lot was still 150 feet away, right? And so it wasn't super close, but I was still concerned about it. And he was, expressing his desire to protect the creek, which sounded like a good idea. But the other thing Nadine said was, well, that particular house is, although it looks it doesn't look all that good on the map. You got to remember that's going to be raised above the the floodplain. It's going to be like 30 feet high, and we all said, yeah, that's true. All right, you got that one. And I'm thinking, the particular environmental issue I was talking about are birds, right?
Which could be 100 feet above.
Birds, in my estimation, are not going to be worried about a 30-foot height, nor are they going to be all that concerned about 150-foot or 200-foot lateral. We've got an issue where we can, and the point is, we'd already neg decked it, and we brought Nadine what Nadine was saying about, guys, first of all, I'd never do that. My kids are going to inherit this, and the birds, they're just my point was, that's where you turn to either Greg or Dave or somebody, or Bruce Barber, and say, what about that? Is that kosher or not? If he said, yeah, the bird's never going to get 30 feet, don't worry. Okay, then you're good, but then you've got a smart person, not that you're not, but I call them smart people. They've got letters after them and making that decision and not us. And so I'm telling you what I've been seeing, which is with all these red flags, and that's why, again, best thing for SEQRA review is identify the issue, do all the work to get to the bottom line. Don't worry about the part 2. Don't worry about the regulatory stuff. follow the facts and the issues, and by the time you get done, you will have satisfied yourself and the public that you've got. And don't say, well, we don't have jurisdiction, or
Sure.
you've got to, in my view, and it depends to some extent on the policies of the town, and I understand in some projects, you're gonna be more interested in sort of giving them a little bit of encouragement than not, but at the end of the day, if you want to do SEQRA, and if it's gonna be used as it's intended, you're gonna get to those environmental impacts, crunch them, get through them, and then you're ready to do it.
So you're essentially saying we shouldn't make a secret determination until after a public hearing?
Well, that we can, I would suggest opening a public hearing before you make your secret determination under some quirky rules that I'm not going to explain tonight. If you want to know, I could. You need to, for a subdivision, you need to have a public hearing after the declaration of significance, if it's a neg deck. And so I would just say leave the damn thing open, listen to people, hold the public hearing, then don't jump to close the public hearing, and don't jump to make any determinations. But if you get to the point where you make a neg deck, make the neg deck, and then continue the public hearing on the subdivision approval, which is what these quirky cases require.
So to the chair's point before, we need to be able to operationalize this in terms of.
Agreed.
First you do A, then you do B, then you do C, and if C takes you to C.
The problem though is that every project is different, and you're gonna have a different speed of environmental impact.
But then what you need to do with us
Yeah,
is.
go ahead.
Whoa, guys.
Well, you tell me, do I wait for you to ask me, or do I jump into a meeting and just jump in the middle of the table and say, I haven't been doing that. I've been sitting here like this, going,
No, the Jacob, for example, had we not done that, I don't remember what we, actually,
Which one?
to Jacob, we did that
In
when
that
you
deck.
weren't even here.
and don't get me wrong, I didn't know it was a flyway either, but when I advised
But
that
what
part,
I'm saying is, we did the Jacob on a different ages, if you would. And I
Administration.
would have much rather have had somebody say, whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do it if that's what you guys do.
So,
Yeah.
so this is what I would like.
I'm very conscious of not jumping up and saying, wait.
Hang on. So procedural. I like how we go around the room and we give everybody the opportunity to talk. I don't like that we go around and then we go back and then we go back and then we go back. We're gonna, in 2024, we are going to give everybody the opportunity to talk. In addition to you and Dave, Greg, and all of our, so at that time, that's where you could say, based on what I have right now, you would say, I think we need to do this, this, and this. Great. Dave, what do you think? Well, we have this, this, and this. Now we need to get Greg involved in this and this.
Let's do this. The first time you want to go around is something that is not necessarily environmental. It's really more things like compliance.
Knowledge. Yep.
Your map sucks because you didn't.
Yeah,
Right,
something
right.
like-
Operational.
Or the law requires us to do this, or stuff. So let's go around and make sure that they can just be in the door for us.
Sure.
Then the next step is when you start, then really the next thing is to talk about SEQRA, and there's two ways to go on it. One is to declare ourselves lead agency and set that up and get the type straight. and
Do
all
we
that.
do that on every application?
Yeah.
So we need to say for the record,
We'll get to those procedures in a second, but what I want to do is, then, if we get past, are they in the right place, et cetera, have we done the right, have we started the SEQRA process? Then the conversation should be, all right, what are the impacts? Rick, what do you think the impacts are? Zori, what do you think the impacts are?
exactly.
And if you say, look, I'm not a scientist, I don't know, it looks like it's gonna cause a lot of traffic. Then when we go around the room, then we go to David and Greg and say, all right, you guys tell us what you think the impacts are. The applicant will also may have put some impacts on the table in their part one or something like that. Then when we get them with that, we'll have a list of impacts to start.
That's a great idea.
And then we move forward with the impact. Now that you've decided they're in the door the right way and they haven't violated the zoning law, which we also get from the code enforcement officer, then we're moving forward on the impacts. And we don't even worry about the regulatory stuff. We're not talking about holding public hearings. We're not talking about doing the part two. We're not talking about site plan approval. We're not talking about anything. We just want to know
What are the impacts?
what the impacts are, because then we're going to start broadcasting that to all these other involved agencies.
So does planning board know of the DEC resource mapper?
Yeah.
Okay, so, just that.
That's
That's
Well, I
his
know he knows,
responsibility.
but we should all be taking,
Yeah, 'cause
it's
you guys-
easy to use, and it'll let you know if there's endangered species,
Yeah, we
wetlands,
use
etc.
it. We use
So I
it.
just
We use
know.
You
what
guys
are.
are actually, who's making a good point. Identifying the environmental issues actually cannot simply be left to the environmental experts for the simple reason that they're not from the town and they may not know the town. You guys know the town, so one thing you can throw in is when I was a kid growing up, there was the salamanders were up there.
Yep.
We used to go hunt them all the time, and it had this funny red spot in the middle. Is that important or not? And maybe they can answer that question. We need to hear from you. You guys know are the experts on the town, so we need to know about the salamanders. We need to know about the traffic. We need to know about that the noise bounces off the mountain, and we hear it all over the town.
Sure.
They may not know it, but if you tell them that, then Greg will have to come up with a way.
And that's
to
where
like
we
that.
always do that. We go, oh, this area is known for, or, we're worried about this area because of the past of
That's
this, or we did a subdivision there and it was really wet, whatever the case may be. So, I think that that's good, but back to Rick's point, which is operational. The board, I want the go around of the board to bring everybody's input in. Rick will say parking, Zorian will say core habitat. You gotta be 100 feet from the buffer.
So these now into the secret issues.
No. These are just map items. That's a requirement for the town, okay? Now we got all these map items. Dave has already done his review by now. We've gotten Greg involved by now. And now, once we've sort of planted our seed as to what we find, now it's,
What Greg typically does is the applicant's got two choices. Either they can pay Greg to do all this stuff,
Yeah.
or they can pay their own person to do it.
which in our board, we require them to pay their own person, and then they pay our person to
Right.
make sure theirs is right.
Right, that's the very typical model. We can argue whether it's a good idea or not, but that's what's almost always done.
Yep.
Rather than, and it's not like Greg's gotta go hire people
No.
and they will do it. So,
Yep.
but Greg and Dave and through you will say, all right, this is what we've identified through our collective intelligence. We need you to look at this, and this.
Exactly.
And when you look at this and this, you've got to do this study and this study and this study. You've got to do the traffic,
Yep.
and then they will go. Oh, Dean does this all the time.
Sure.
He goes, all right, just give me a list of things to do. And
Yep.
and then it'll take 2 months. Then they'll come back with the study.
Exactly.
And then we send it back to them and say, was it done right? Does this make any sense? Was it done right? Troubleshoot this. And that's the process that's governed by us, but that they
I
do.
think where you're going, at the first meeting, forget about the 2-lot subdivision, that may be an issue, but the bigger ones, 4 lots to J or whatever.
Sure.
So we go around the table, your map is all.
Yep.
Is it at that first meeting, second meeting, third, that
When do we get them involved?
Dave is saying, I've reviewed what they submitted to us, and I've got all these issues?
It's gonna be different because sometimes we get a guy coming in like at the airport speed where he shows his overalls and says, I'm kind of here, let's talk about this. And sometimes people will come in, Nadine will come in, she's already have 6 studies done. So if she has the studies done, he's got a traffic, I know I'm gonna need a traffic study, I know I'm gonna need a wetland study. She may just come with the studies, you just give it right to them. I'm not gonna specify, there's no specific process. The key thing is to use your intelligence to look at this and say, all right, I've got to make sure the map is right and all these other things are checked, but I also want to start thinking about the broader environment. And, it's always the same thing in development in a rural town. Is it going to cause traffic? Is it going to cause noise? Are we going to start overloading the schools, which is a kind of a dicey secret issue, but it's very common. All these things, kind of know what they all are, depending what the project is. And so you've got this list of things, and you could have different ones are going to be, sometimes it's going to be obvious. Sometimes you're going to have to say to Greg, does this pose a potential traffic problem? Does this pose a potential noise problem? But the point is, we're making those determinations based on our parameters, and then we tell the applicant, we need you to study this. What we did with the fellow from the Airport Speedway is the first thing we did was decided not to require a noise review, and then we started talking to them. We said, I'm just going to have a couple of events here and a couple of events there, and I'd never create more noise. And you just have this conversation, and ultimately we say we're concerned about this because we have to be, because we have to turn it around and certify to them that this is not going to cause any adverse impact. So how are we going to do that? Help us out here.
Right.
Everyone's going to be different, Rick. There's going to be no single set thing. But actually, what I've told you now is actually much more specific on this type of thing than I was prepared to do. But it's actually really good. This is what, when we come in, you should be thinking, how are we going to get to the bottom of the environmental impacts here? And you may know that it's going to be a fast process. The guy's doing a 3-lot subdivision. It's not going to be a big deal. Then the question would be to Dave and to Greg, how do we certify? What A's, B's, C's, D's, and E's do we need to do to certify that?
So I think that on procedural, back to the operational procedure, we go around the room with the board members, have conversations, because that's what we're here to do. And then we would include the consultants after our review and what we developed as our concerns from a local standpoint. And then, if Anne Marie says, oh, I think that, there's a core habitat issue here, or Zorian says, maybe we have a flooding issue here, whatever the case may be, that's where you would get involved as to what's the next step seeker wise.
Yeah, but
Dave would get,
I don't guys need to consider, if it's a question of, let's say, core habitat, is it really that valuable, and figure out how much time it's gonna take to go around the room for 7 people to give their opinion on what I'll call on environmental issues?
well, we might not think that it's a problem.
Well, but you may not, my point is, you may not know.
Of course, sure.
So how should we do it?
And so I would suggest to you that as opposed to the map type of stuff and the things that you do know much better than, for example, what I do, when it comes to the environmental issues, whether you even want to go around.
Okay.
Other than to say, Rick was, I'm concerned about the noise, okay, but don't, or maybe you want to say, why, because it bounces off, use your judgment, but ultimately, when it comes to the environmental issues, your experts, not only, they may not know the specifics of the actual site, but they're gonna say, I've seen 25 projects like this before. Dave has probably seen 100 of them.
Sure.
He's been around a while, he's in the county. And so I've seen this 100 times. This is the way it's gonna go, or this is what we need to do.
So operationally,
So there's a lot here.
20 pages worth, don't have any.
And we haven't even
We're on
got
page
to-
1.
okay.
so my goal for tonight's meeting, just Dave, so you understand, my goal for tonight's meeting, and
This is a start of the
right,
conversation.
my goal for tonight's meeting was to
First opinion.
confirm or deny that our seeker practices are correct. When we do it, how we do it, and is it legally, I want to make sure we're covering ourselves legally. So when should we do seeker?
Seeker was your whole.
When should we do the determination of seeker?
Determination of significance?
Yes.
Way toward the end.
Okay, so we're doing that correctly now.
Yeah, but we.
Well, no, you
we
did,
do it
you
before.
did,
Right.
you did the Jaeger.
Hang on, we're doing it towards the end. We're just doing it, we need to do it after the public hearing instead of before. And then, once the public hearing is completed, we would do our declaration of significance.
Keep it open. Public hearing.
Keep it open.
Once we do the declaration,
No,
No.
keep the public hearing.
Start first.
keep the public hearing open, do the declaration, and then close it after the declaration's been completed at the next meeting.
We can do this, we'll have more, we can all go back and sleep on this and have
Well,
more
hang on,
questions.
this is important to me because I need to know when,
You keep
You
it
may not,
open.
you keep the public hearing open. You've identified the environmental issues. You give it to, our expert to.
you're saying do the public hearing at the beginning of the application?
No, you leave it,
Towards the end.
when you get
Like
enough.
2/3 in?
Speak.
Here's my suggestion. Respectfully, I would not be asking these questions because it's the problem. Do not look toward a milestone of achievement, particularly on the regulatory side. Your process is going to be driven by the seeker review. So don't even think about the public hearing, or don't even think about even the part 2, which is part of the seeker review. Think about how do we identify issues? How do we get the applicant moving toward resolving the issues? How do we get our consultants engaged in the issues? How do we evolve? How do those issues play out over time? And only once those issues are, when you can see them playing out, we've risen in our level of knowledge, we're peaking, and now we're starting to come toward conclusions. Only at that time can we begin thinking about how do we begin to open or close a public hearing? How do we begin to draft our part 2, et cetera? If there's one thing to take away from tonight, it is that respect the seeker process as being helpful to you, as being critically important legally, and as ultimately and it's helpful because it's going to drive this, and don't get in its way. And by the seeker process, I am not talking about any regulation on paper necessarily. Again, this is all between those regulations. It is driven by the impact. And in a 10-lot subdivision is going to have a different feel and a different zeitgeist than a 3-lot subdivision, unless the 3-lot subdivision is right in the middle of a wetland or something, or critical.
Understood.
And all you know is when you walk in the room, all you should be worrying about is what do my consultant, what do the applicants say about these impacts? Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? What do my people say about the impacts? Do we believe this? How do the impacts that are identified, how does it sit with me? Do I think we need to mitigate it? Let the governance of the impacts govern your process until we get to a point where we're on a glide path that we think we know where it's going. And that's what we have not been doing. And again, the mistake that I see is jumping toward a regulatory conclusion like for instance, no noise study or a neg deck for the jig. And I'm not even criticizing you guys because you didn't know about that. What I'm saying is, I see this as a common mindset. We're you're even saying, how far when do I get to do the things that I want to do to get them out the door? That concept is inconsistent with the freedom that the SEQRA review. It may end up being not much different. It may be 1 month.
I'm just trying to understand sort of the time frame of the process, because again,
Each site plan could be different.
sure, on a 2-lot subdivision, we could walk in and go, hey, the map is great.
Don't get me wrong. We do 75% of the stuff right. I mean, even on Diego, we've had a very expansive time process. The question is, how effective has it been? How efficient has it been? And again, I'm not criticizing. I'm telling you from my perspective, once you start getting into projects that do have impacts, you've got to let that process my suggestion would be to let that process play through, give your consultants the freedom they need. Don't let the applicant squirrel out of stuff. Because they've been a great person in the town for 20 years, or their wife would beat them over the head, or their kids love them, or the neighbors love them, or they never do it. Or the birds aren't going to get up. It's just
right.
You have Dave and Greg talk to their person, and Nadine's really good at this stuff. But don't let
She's good at. Can we have a public hearing?
Yeah.
So she'll always say no.
We'll get to a public hearing when we answer every one of these questions to the point where everybody.
I guess I see it as a different aspect, because using the part 2, the long form, an application, I'm just using a 2-lot compared to a 10-lot subdivision. I could ask Dave to say, hey, review the part 2 that came in initially at application. And then he can go, Mark, of the 10 things, 7 of them are of concern. Okay. At that point, those are the 7 things that I'm going to want to hear from the applicant as to the answers. Great. So now we have that set. Now we go around the room, and Zorian might have identified an 8th because of this bird flyaway. Great. Dave, let's get on to number 8. So now, Nadine or applicant A, it's your responsibility to come back to us when all these 8 items have been answered, and studies and whatever needs to be done. We're not going to let you back on the agenda until all these items have been completed.
I'm going to make an observation that you can take a look.
Sure.
What you're doing with the part 2 is the same thing I would do without the part 2, because really the part 2 is a crutch, and it also doesn't tell you anything you don't know. If you look at the part 2, every impact on a part 2 that's identified is something you already know is in, whether it applies to a project or not. I mean, it's going to say, historical stuff,
yep,
or habitat or anything like that. So what you're doing with the part 2 going through it, I would just do sitting in the chair next to you saying, all right, we've got a project here. I'm going to talk to Dave. I'm going to talk to Greg. I'm going to think myself. I'm going to listen to Nadine. What are the impacts that I care about? And I'd be able to name the same ones that are on the part 2. So the part 2 you're either reaching for because you want to get that regulatory thing out of the way.
Yeah.
But okay.
No, wait a minute. You don't want to get it out of the way.
No, I want to make sure we identify what our concern.
Getting it out of the way, we move too quickly.
No, I'm talking identification of what is concerned. Every application is different. What's our identification?
The part 2 actually has the legitimate function of the part 2 is to identify issues to be looked at in part 3.
That's my goal.
You can do that, but my response would be, you run the risk of doing it. First of all, you are going to be accelerating your specific your specific action. Second of all, you may as well put down the paper and just listen to what people are saying, and then figure out what impacts you want to tell me.
Right, but that's where we might miss something, and that's my concern.
Possibly, but yeah, maybe if the part 2 helps jog your memory about certain things.
Well, I can literally go through this application at the first meeting and go, okay, we know that organizationally you need a topo, your date's wrong, the land surveyor didn't sign the map, all those things, but an impact on land, I think that 1C is a big concern. Does everybody agree? Yes.
Here's what I would suggest. Here's where you really should do it. We'll just pick on Nadine just because.
Yeah, it's easy.
If Nadine walks in here with a part 2, and she's got something checked, small to moderate impact, let's just say it's traffic.
Yep.
And you're like, no, you're not getting away with it. Because when she does that, she means we're done with that issue. That issue's gone. And that's why it means we're not going to do it on a part 3 if it's a small to moderate impact, which means basically it's done.
That's why I don't really care what the applicant provides.
So she said, Nadine, question 1C, you check small to no impact for traffic, and we don't buy it. So just erase that little check. But that's what you're doing. Okay.
You like that idea?
If that, yeah, because if you know she's trying to sneak out of something that Greg has already told you,
And that's my
look
concern.
at this
What I-
intersection.
I like what you do going around asking for all the input.
Thank you.
I don't like when we go through, as a board, we go through that step by step by step. We should have both of our consultants doing that for us, and either at that first meeting, second meeting, third meeting, saying, wait a minute, guys, I heard all your stuff. I've gone through in detail this,
And 2F is a problem.
and all of these items are a problem. I don't want to do that without these guys
Agreed.
having seen it and being able to think about it
I'm with you.
and
I also
chew
want-
on it.
I also want to say one more thing. I'm reacting to these questions very quickly in real time, and I may go back and think, geez, I missed this.
Oh, that's okay.
So don't take this all,
No,
but you see what I'm.
We're gonna have a lot more of
I'm
this
telling you that-
conversation.
I want the SEQRA review and the impacts to drive it. So when you ask me a specific question, I'm gonna try to answer it as best I
No,
can. but then
I'm trying to be it procedurally because in the event I'm not in this seat one day, I want the procedure to be, I want to protect the town procedurally that we did, we covered all of our bases, whether it be everything in here, everything that he says, Greg says, everything in here, 617 dash whatever. My goal is that procedurally, we have checked every box, meaning we've done it.
I think we've done that, but one thing that we've done, I think erroneously, is to go through stuff too quick because we want to check the box and move on to whatever the hell the next thing. So I don't think we're doing, I think, and I don't know what slowing down means. I think it means, but part two is let the experts that we have you say, here's what I believe of part two. Yeah, we can review it. Everybody's supposed to review this.
So should we let our experts provide their part too? To
No.
us?
I don't know.
I would just say-
No.
And again, I know you have a strong preference for doing it through the part two, and that's.
Oh, it doesn't matter.
That's actually what it's for.
Sure.
Which is fine, as opposed to, the declaration of significance end, which is not really what the part two is for. But what I would say, I hear you, and if you want to do it, if that really makes you feel better, I won't stand in the way of that. But what I would say is, conceptually, let your analysis and your thoughts about the environmental impacts of the project govern all your steps moving forward until you get a significant basis of knowledge. And to do that, I would poll the entire board because they know the town. And I would make sure that your consultants have looked at all of the issues that you think might be important, including the ones the applicant raises. And at that point, you have a pretty good handle on it, but you may, and so we're gonna go through our secret review. And then before we finalize it, we still may have missed stuff as we discovered with Diego. We discovered a bunch of things with Diego.
And that's where I'm going at
actually.
right now. Is there something that we could have done differently that would have caught the
Opening
information
the
of?
public hearing before you do the declarations. You're
Okay,
gonna have to
that-
hold it
that
open
solves that
after,
problem.
but if you open it first, Ira Stern would have come in,
We
talk about the
did.
words,
We did.
and not only Ira, by the way. It was, I believe it was only during the public hearing, it was after the neg deck that people came in and started complaining about the use of both of those private roads.
Correct.
So we're finding out that, significant lengths of private, I mean, this is not just a 500-foot driveway they're talking about, these are roads, I don't know how.
2,000 feet long.
Thousands of feet long, and, perhaps dozens of people, and perhaps, and so, I don't know, again, that would not lead to an EIS probably, but it'd be the sort of thing that we want everybody to have thought about in great detail
review
before
it.
we neg deck it. And this occurred after the neg deck, so this gives you a very real sense of the types of things that you're going to miss, even with all the intelligence in this room,
Right.
not to mention the applicant's intelligence, but not gonna let you in on all of it. Then when you open it up, you may have a different, completely different perspective or, different parallax, whatever.
So on that same topic of procedure, just trying to stick to sort of some organization. We go through everything, our consultants review, and there's not any member of the public.
Then you're good. I mean, you're not expected to be geniuses, and you're not expected to reinvent the wheel, and you're not expected to know it. All we can do is what we can do, but my goal is to not have you guys cut off your own, not
Sure.
shoot yourselves in the foot or cut off what you're doing because you're trying to jump to get them.
Of course.
I understand the desire to get them out the door. I would suggest if we can still get them out the door quickly, but it's gonna take a lot more and a lot more efficient work.
Well, I think that our initial meeting, when Zorian goes through his list of items and Elena comes through their list and Zach goes through their list and everybody identifies the issues, that's when Dave and Greg are writing down everybody's problems or concerns. That gives the applicant the understanding of, okay, here's the 14 things that are outstanding that we need to talk about. And then Dave and our consultants can go back and say, okay, because Zorian mentioned lighting, we need you to provide all the lumens that go along with your dark sky compliant. Then he's gonna say, okay, with all of your areas of disturbance, now you're potentially triggering a SWIP. We need you to get, all of these things that are going to be going through the process based on our
Let
conversation.
me give you another example. Were you guys aware in terms of the discussion tonight on noise? This is after we've already decided that the noise study wasn't necessary. That the question, first of all, I was wondering exactly what we were doing, and we can circle back to that. But the other thing about the noise was, were you guys all aware that the noise measurements that are of concern are at every property line?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
exactly.
So when he's taking these measurements both before and after, they're at all the property lines. Okay, that was not mentioned.
We didn't point out to him. We didn't point out to him.
You did point out.
We did not.
No,
But
it was
he's
that,
been doing them for years. He puts
Right.
them in every year, so
Okay.
he's absolutely 100% aware.
He pays somebody to do that. We
Okay.
have that report.
He's-
I was, that's one thing I was thinking about was,
I'm sure he doesn't know. He just pays somebody to do it.
Right.
it's measuring the delta at the property line and whatever the
Well,
baseline.
he's measuring, he can't exceed 79 decibels because of that local law.
79.
No, the local law.
It's a delta.
Local
10
law
over the
3
ambient.
Oh, hang on.
He's talking about racing.
You're talking about racing?
Racing.
Okay, so
He
racing
doesn't
is
have anything but racing now.
Yeah,
correct. So when he does a decibel reading,
It's just about hitting that maximum.
exactly.
Well, but then.
He's
it
not
depends on
doing
concerts.
ambient.
Are
He's just
the-
measuring,
Are the
right.
concerts going to be?
He's just measuring whether he exceeds 79 decibels.
yeah, and some kind of average, somebody come up with.
Anyway.
Well, no, the average is of raw data.
Fair
Well,
enough.
but hang on, Alina, the average is of raw data.
No, but I'm agreeing with
Oh,
as
okay.
far
So
as,
anyway,
the measurements of.
what we
how
can
many
do is,
feet of
I don't want to
Put a meter
overthink
up,
it now
see if
because I
it
can't,
exceeds 79.
we're asking you all the time. If you want, as we go through the next couple of projects, I can comment on them, say this is the time when I want to get from Greg or Dave or something like that to let us know. Or if you do want to poll the board, let's just talk about the map issues or the specific
Yeah,
issues for getting in the door, and let's hold.
I think
off on-
our first meeting, I'm just thinking procedurally, our first meeting is when we, as the board, I'm gonna use the bad verbiage of beat up the applicant. That's when we go, hey, where's your topo? Where's your septic approval? Where's your well location? Where's your driveway coming in? Does that meet sight lines? All of the map requirements.
And the risk,
Then-
and the risk you've got is that if you beat up the applicant without having the full set of knowledge that you need, you may be sending a false idea, that it may end up being the idea that the applicant is, if I just do these 5 things he mentioned, I'm home free. When Greg and Dave haven't even said, you've got to do.
Well, they would be a part of that round of the board. So Rick would say driveway and septic. Zori would say well location. Where's the circle on the well location? And your floodplain, we need the 100-foot buffer. You need to outline core forest and rocky outcrops. And Zach will say, yeah, where's your stone walls? And that's when I can go to Dave and he can go, hang on a second. We haven't talked about noise.
Yeah.
Or hang on, where's the birds flying?
And because I don't pretend to be the source of all knowledge on this, in terms of especially how this board would operate, I definitely want to hear if Dave has a different impression and we want to modify this, or could modify as we go forward.
Sure.
What my goal was just to get you guys aware that this is a potential problem, and that you need, by respecting the job of the SEQRA review, you then actually help to organize, but it's a completely different level of organization because it's not in the regulation. It's essentially what we're doing to get to the point where we actually regulate this project environmentally by this give and take over the course of these months, and so that we get to the point when we do a neg deck, we've solved the problems of environmental impact.
2 things I want to do now. I want Dave to sort of weigh in on that operation and procedurally, and then from there, I'd like the board to probably finish for tonight, and I'd like to probably schedule a February workshop to continue this conversation for training, February or March. It doesn't have to be right.
Before we go,
Dave, what have we done correct with Gary in terms of the process?
the whole thing's incorrect. It's just,
Incorrect.
because all you're doing is have, well, for a bunch of things. His proposal is going to lead to environmental impacts. Have we done a study of any of them? An organized study where you could say, this is going to cause this, and this is what it's going to lead to, and it's going to be mitigated. We've come up, and with all respect, and so I don't mean to be pejorative, I'll just be plain. What I heard last meeting, after the public spoke, and the public was very clear, and they were generally not happy, although because of the culture, they were actually being somewhat deferential. In a different town, they would have been with pitchforks.
Yeah.
And they gave a bunch of impacts, and then when the board discussed it afterwards, discussed it with Gary, we dismissed almost all of them based on a bunch of different, we don't have jurisdiction over it, or that's, how are we gonna do that, or, and I was, again, I didn't jump in, but I was like, and then we also did it at the beginning tonight, and then to the extent that we were interested, and we're having a conversation with him over whether his neighbors like him. This is not, every time he says something like that, or Nadine, it's just a negative, because and usually it usually is effective in making us not follow up. We should be telling him, we're concerned about this, we're concerned about this, we're concerned about this, starting with the noise has to be dealt with, because he's got 12 new events, and they're different than the racing, and we heard some people, and we don't have to believe the public, we can think that they're full of it, but we gotta decide that they are. Some people were saying music is worse than racing. I was surprised about that, but I don't have either one in my backyard, and so I heard what they said, and we should think about that. We should decide, and more to the point, do we need to determine whether if he holds a concert, there's a chance that it might exceed 10 decibels. See, the other thing I found wrong was everything we were talking about in terms of him doing these measurements, they're all after the fact, because I get the baseline is fine, however we want to measure it. Then he's going to measure his event, right? He's going to find, well, I went over, I went under, it was fine. That's all after. Oh, we have to write a site plan approval that tells him what he can and can't do to make sure that he's going to comply with the zoning. So if he's got an allowed delta of 10 at the property line, that's what the zoning allows, 10 at the property line. Let's assume he's got all different types of events. We may not care about any of them except for music. Music is the big one at this point, and the possibility of one or two others, right? A rodeo. Rodeo, music, okay. Let's assume it's those two. Music is the easy one. If he's got a delta of 10 maximum at the property line, how loud does his stage have to be before he surpasses 10? There's a number to that. I don't know how many, right?
Need to know the distance from the stage.
You get a sound engineer, you calculate the attenuation from the stage, wherever that's going to be on his site plan. I don't even know if he's given us a decent site plan, but because the last one I saw was, I think, handwritten. But you get a site plan, the stage is here, this property line is here, this property line is here, the prevailing winds go this way. How many decibels does he, and it may be different depending on what the background is, so maybe you want to get some background information, fine, get the background information. How many decibels maximum can that state? Because I don't want to have, well, I'm not going to, I do the radio station's going to do this, and his buddy, my buddy, and we are a regulatory body. How many decibels does he need at the stage so that with the attenuation that the engineer is going to tell us, he's going to get to a plus 10 or less at the property line? And it may come down to what, you're going to get to 11, down to 9, but more likely we're going to get a decibel number. And then you tell him, we're going to write a permit for you. It's going to cover all different types of events. I don't want to hear that you don't know what you're going to do and this and that. You told us you may do music. Obviously, you may do music. You may do rodeos too. Therefore, we're going to look at what you're doing, take the intelligence to do that, talk to our experts, and tell you that for a music event, you have a maximum on the stage of 90 decibels. Because the nearest property line is 150 feet away.
But the code calls for borderline one and second. Basically, I said, but the code, sorry, 40 years, so can say, said about the borderline, and I give you some reality. Every musician comes and playing music, they never check. It's difficult. You have to check on the borderline.
No, but you're getting into regulations of the town board, not of our.
No, you enforce it. We're going to enforce those regulations. Historians talk about a different problem, which is the problem of enforcement. And yes, you need reality, but at some point,
also conditioning tell the music playing group that your dBA has to be so much. It's unrealistic. We have to measure. Again, I'm getting an argument from that application.
Look, if you're getting into, we're talking about now enforcement issues and implementation issues, and that is not for this board. Now, if the two choices are to not do a regulation of the music at the stage because it's impractical, or to do one, and I would say do it anyway, and if they can't enforce it, they can't. But at the end of the day, you have to turn around to those people and either say, we have done our best, taking all of the issues that we see and that you've raised to try to get on top of it within our jurisdiction, or we haven't. And what I'm telling you is, as I look at this, and I could be, and again, I want to hear from people that know more than I do, and I do not pretend to know everything. But what I'm looking at is, number one, we should at least ask that question. And number two, the answer I would think of, again, maybe it's too simplistic, is I want to know how loud he's going to be here, because you can attenuate sound. Now, if you say, well, nobody's ever going to really look at that, maybe one day out of 10, the building inspector finally gets out of bed, shows up with a sound meter and decides that they're 20 decibels over and shuts it down. That's going to send a message.
No,
Well, but this
no,
is
what I
what-
understand is it's kind of getting to, I agree with you, it could be attenuate, but you're bringing in some more technical complexity to that, rather than
It's
just,
not. There's no-
rather than, there is any event, you go on the borderline, you measure it, is it more than 10, the ambient, that's it.
The problem is, Orion, is when you go to the borderline and you measure, I'm not talking about background now, I'm talking about the actual performance.
Yeah.
That's number one, it's too late. He's already doing it.
But then he turns it down.
No.
If you're at
yeah,
20.
And they don't turn it in.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Nobody in regular.
The point is fundamental. This board
Right.
has to
There's nobody
regulate-
there enforcing
You
it.
could
We don't
never
have
do it.
enough
I
personnel.
can't control that.
You
Wait,
can give them
no, I-
ideas, you can give some guidelines.
Hold on a
You
second.
can give them guidelines.
As a matter of both seeker and your job under the law, you should be making sure that this site plan approval, number one, complies with the law to the extent that we can, and all we have is permitting jurisdiction. We do not do inspections, we do not do
Right,
enforcement.
right.
We do permitting. We write permits. We write a site plan approval. That's a permit and there are conditions on it. Our job, if we approve the project, is to write conditions that we believe will allow the enforcers to make this thing comply with the law. And if we do that, then we can turn to those people and say, we have done our job, unless you believe, Zori, that it's impossible, in which case you should deny the application. We can't guarantee this is gonna comply with the code. We can't guarantee that it's gonna be a non-significant impact, because it might be a significant impact, but we can't control this, therefore this application is denied. We cannot in conscience and according to the law do this.
We're talking about the same thing, but with a little bit different approach. That's essentially.
I'm trying to enforce what I believe is the jurisdiction and the job of this board when an applicant comes in here. It's to turn around and tell the public, especially if they're packing the room, that we have taken all of the reasonable steps in our jurisdiction, including seeker review, to make sure that this thing is not going to screw up your neighborhood.
Right, but how we can decide what the DBAs have to be the source?
Again, there's attenuation. There are
Yeah, but then you need to.
There's a 6 dB decrease with the doubling of distance from the from the source to the receptor.
Okay, but
That's without a barrier. So you can, if you have the source and you know your distances to your
Dorian,
property
I
line.
believe you're expressing skepticism about the ability of the number crunchers to accurately gauge the way the environment works. And that's
No,
probably.
what I'm saying, you bring in complexity, I can bring the complexity, but code, CODE doesn't say about this, that's essentially my point. The CODE says, measure a borderline, that's what I'm trying
Let me try to make this a little bit simpler. There are codes, DEC has stormwater codes that say if you go ahead and clear a certain number of acreage and build a certain number of houses, et cetera, you need to do a stormwater pollution prevention plan. There has to be certain criteria. Let's just take one, and I've been doing this for 30 years when I was back at Riverkeeper, but one of the ones that we were always concerned about in the New York City watershed was the discharge of phosphorus. And there's a certain model that says under a 5-year storm, et cetera, you gotta make sure that the discharge of, let's say, sediments, or that the discharge of water does not exceed half inch in a 5-year storm. There's a certain standard. Now, how do we, as a planning board, implement that standard? The answer is we get the engineers to study it, and then at the end of the day, we force somebody to build a stormwater basin, right? And we cross our fingers that the engineers figured it out right, and then we cross our fingers that the developer is going to clean out the stormwater basin every 5 years. Otherwise, it's not going to work with the dam. But that's what we do is we crossed that engineering barrier by saying we've gone from a performance standard and we're going to translate that through our site plan process to a series of things you gotta do that the engineers tell us should solve the problem. That is your job.
All right, so you're leading us to bringing in the picture a noise sounds consultant that would definitely say that source and in order to have a no more than 10 at the borderline
Unless
of
he
the
tells you you
property, then the source should be such and such. It's fine
And
with me, but
I don't argue against myself, unless, sometimes, look, I'm a pretty, I tend to drive engineers kind of hard, and at some point they turn around and say to me, I'm sorry, I just can't do that. And at that point, we gotta figure out, all right, what do we do now? But if the engineer says, yeah, there's an app for that, we can do that, do it. Because, and frankly, you do it before you even get to the site, but you do it as part of SEQRA. This
So we
lets
should
us
have
say,
We
this
should
lets us
have
say,
we should have done C, we still have to do C.
oh, you're still doing it, we're not there yet, that's right. But don't trip yourself up in the SEQRA process, which is what we were doing.
Should we have, traffic? That was the other thing.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Traffic, well, we've actually got a little problem with traffic, which is that traffic does not really look at whether two cars can squeeze past each other on, let's go Whitfield Road. Traffic tends to look at congestion at intersection, that's the way the engineers have crunched it. And so you're in a very rural area, you may not get a level of service going, you know I'm talking about levels of service
Yeah.
C and D. So sometimes it's hard to translate the impacts that people feel, which is a secret thing, into engineer speak, and that's something that we're, as a rural town, we're gonna have to deal with. But again, I'm not gonna argue against myself. The first question I'm gonna turn to Greg and say, can we do this? Will this work? Will this work? How do we look at this issue? And at the end of the day, we may have to just do a thumbnail. I don't know, at some point it's gonna get hard, but my point is, I don't want to assume it's hard and then say we're not gonna do it because we don't have jurisdiction. We've got to ask the question, get
Let me
Greg
ask-
here.
Let me ask the obvious question. We're heading in the direction of, we'll listen to the public again in February.
On April.
We'll close the public hearing.
Don't close the public hearing. Why?
Why are we leaving it open?
Because if we have another, why not? I mean,
What else can anybody bring to us that would be of environmental?
are we gonna have somebody, the engineer, do some sort of a study to crunch whether so the engineer does the study, and maybe we want to hear from the public, say, oh, that study's really good, but you're forgetting the fact that on, 3 or 4 days in between May and July every year, we get a certain type of it's before a thunderstorm, so the pressure goes down to 28, and that's gonna make the sound travel. I mean,
I'm gonna tell.
why jump to
You know
do
what I'm
things you
gonna
don't
say
have
to
to do?
So what?
Well, you may have to change, Greg said,
Yeah, I
oh, don't-
disagree.
oh, I didn't know. Well, this is always your discretion. Well, I'm just
thinking, I don't
what I'm
think we
pushing
could
back
hear-
on is the instinct to
I don't
close,
think there's anything to
don't
do.
close the study until you straighten out the street. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
So I
and
think- I
Jordan,
think
wait, I
that-
just wanna say, Jordan, you're talking about concerts before and sounds and stuff like that, if they do have a concert. Every concert has a different sound engineer. They don't have the same sound system, so we could do a study one day and it's perfect. The next day, they might have two
That's what
bands
I'm saying.
opening for the main guy. So the thing is, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of personnel. You're talking, if there's 3 different concerts going on at once at 3 different venues up, or even 4, if we include everybody.
Right.
You're not gonna have that personnel from the town out there. You're not gonna have these people every time they change.
That's what
the
Dorian's complaint is, we don't have the enforcement.
We don't have the
I
enforcement.
know
way to
that,
get
I
it.
know
And
that,
there's
but
no way to
we
get
need to put, we need to put, some, requirements for enforcement.
But we do have, but it's not going to happen. It's
Well,
just because.
it's not gonna happen, it's
We
another
don't
story.
have
It's
enough-
another story, then
We
don't
don't have
review
enough people
application.
to
let
go
them do
out to
what
do
they
these
do.
sound
Let me,
studies.
I want to make one more point, and that's, this is more practical, and I really appreciate the practical limitations, but there's also pushback here. If we were to continue on a path that we sort of let things go because, that if an applicant says, I would never do that, the message gets out, and I believe the message has gotten out, because I've been now with you guys for a little bit more than a year, and I've seen the dynamics. The applicants not only believe they can come in here and say things to you that just kind of push you out of the way, they expect it. And if they don't get their way when they do it, they get annoyed. They're probably running up the flagpole for all I know, but because I could see that they expect it. And they expect once they come up with, well, the dog ate my homework. For Christ's sake.
Because they've seen other applicants get
Absolutely.
away with
So
it,
the
that's
point is,
why.
if we
They've
flip
seen
it,
happen.
Dorian, and even if you were to require studies, or even for that matter, require a thing that maybe could not be enforced 100% of the time, maybe it could 50% of the time, but maybe not all the time, that's gonna start sending a message. We're gonna look at the stuff you bring in here, we're not gonna let you,
Fine with me.
right? And so you may not get 100% enforcement, but you may begin to change the
Going down the road,
dynamics.
you're going down the road, what you're saying is probably true. I would take it to its logical conclusion, since we can't enforce it, we don't have any commercial events, because we're just letting it go into
You
a
know what?
hell of a high basket. That ain't gonna happen.
Here's the logical,
Right.
here's the logical
I
conclusion.
agree.
If your enforcer is not diligent with ways to enforce things and getting out there and doing it, this is going to accelerate the process perhaps of getting a better enforcement mechanism in the town. Once the if the planning board doesn't set up the requirements, nobody's ever gonna bother with whether the enforcer's doing his job. If the planning board for the next 10 projects has a whole bunch of requirements for enforcement and implementation that would maybe solve some of the public's problems, and it doesn't get done in town hall, then the argument later on is, we've done our job,
Well, frankly, I think
We do that.
for every project, except perhaps for Gary's, and it's a different, we need to talk more about it. For every project that involved noise, let me tell you something, we made them jump through hoops.
And I can tell from.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I disagree upon that, I
And
don't think we made a lot of people jump.
But they didn't do, in terms of enforcement, in terms of checking, coming back and checking and rechecking, it's just not happening.
And by the way, I could be wrong on any of the things I'm saying, and I don't mean to in any way, be pejorative or whatever. My goal here is to get you guys thinking about these issues a little bit differently. Get you guys thinking about these issues in terms of your jurisdiction, the importance of your jurisdiction, the importance of SEQRA in your jurisdiction, in terms of trying to ensure that the impacts that are complained of don't happen. You may not be able to get to it. I understand that, but I don't want that to be your default instinct. That sounds hard. We're not going to do it either because we can't figure it out, or the building inspector would never enforce it. Your first instinct would be, how can we get on top of this environmental issue so that the public is at least theoretically or potentially protected, and then we can get some.
So did we get sort of screwed by the building inspector deciding that this was a site plan as opposed to a special use?
I cannot begin to understand. I mean, seriously, this is a special event. There's no bulldozers at all. There's nothing being built. It's a special event. Special events requires special use permit, and there's a very good reason why. An event can come and go. It could be a circus. There could be no physical impact at all, but it's the use. And that's why God created special use permits. And somehow your building inspector managed to decide,
Very beginning, I was saying.
even though the previous approval.
We don't have any,
wasn't-
we can't even discuss that.
I was answering his question.
No, I know, but the question, although it's a good one, we don't have any jurisdiction over that. And half the things that, whether he
Agreed. But here's-
gave or not, is not, I know, but we're going down a rabbit hole of this. And that is, we can't worry about who is the code enforcement officer today.
That's right.
We have to focus on the position of code enforcement officer. It is our job as our board to create a decision, a permit, as Dave is using the verbiage,
Right.
that regardless of who's in that position today, who the owner is today, what the use is going to be focused on in the future, we have to focus on what is that site going to be doing for the rest of our time, its time,
And here's
not the owner's time.
Here's the good news, Rick.
Right.
Everything that Mark said is right. But here's the good news. Okay, we should have had an SUP on this, and a site plan, but certainly SUP. We don't. But here's the good news. And it goes back to what I said, the first thing that I said. SEQRA requires you to look at all of the impacts. And so any of the impacts that would be mitigated or covered or addressed in the SUP, we can just do as a matter of SEQRA. Whether it's noise or lights or anything that the SUP would have required, and that is not in your, let's say, your site plan code. Remember, SEQRA does not depend on what's in the code. SEQRA covers everything. And so if there's something that's out there that should have been part of the SUP process, in fact, I'll tell you now, you can just look at the SUP requirements, and if you see something that's falling through the cracks, we just load it right into our SEQRA review as an impact. You express it as a potential impact, and then you can tell him, and he's going to say, "My gosh, I'd have to hire somebody to do that. And all I want to do is make money, and my kids fine." Oh, you wanna get this permit, you wanna get the, you're gonna look at the impact on noise and lights or whatever it is, because
All right,
that's what we.
So,
Can I just?
well, hang on just a second. I want, first of all, we need to end this meeting because
I know, but
we're going over our paid time. So go ahead quickly.
So simple question is, currently, today, how does SEQRA apply to agritourism? Do they get, I mean, does all this apply to them as well, or does it not? They can do whatever they want, noise, this, that, and everything else, or does it actually apply to them? People that are underneath the umbrella of agritourism.
Okay.
I mean, I don't want you to go to the whole thing. If you-
No, you're in a, why don't we save that for
Could
February?
we- No, well, no, I really like to know, because I really want to, like, is it a yes or a no?
It
Does
depends
it-
on, first of all,
Depends on their
depends on,
request.
depends on where it is. If the project is in a county ag zone,
Right,
Ag
all-
district.
right,
ag
right,
district.
well, hence.
all of the
agritourism.
things I just said, everything that you,
And it's a farm operation.
right, well, that's, we see that agritourism.
Which is not necessarily an apartment.
And you and I have.
Okay, so
a
we
little
will have
different-
to open that.
That's correct.
Yes.
Here's the rule.
Their rules are different.
In a county ag district, if they're doing something called a farm operation, which can be very liberally interpreted, and Dave and I may have a little different interpretation. Our ability to turn some of these regulatory and investigatory screws is broken almost completely. And Dave and I disagree on how much it's broken, but the bottom line is the state can come in if the farmer, quote unquote, you know, feels that he's being unfairly infringed upon by what we're doing, they can go up to the state open markets, state open markets can come in and throw us out of the water. And if we can have a long conversation about exactly what the and.
Yeah,
So the agribusiness is not part of a farm operation, we have a lot of problems.
Because they were.
Because I mean,
So-
literally, I've been studying it on and off for the last 2 years, some things have been changing, and I'm like, it's just,
If it's not in a farm district,
yeah,
then we're pretty, it's just like any other site plan.
okay, yeah, I was just curious. Because
All right, so this is what we're gonna do. First things first is, it's 10 minutes to 9, so if you wanna log that time for us. We'll close today's meeting. We'll need a motion to adjourn.